welcome to the third and unfortunately final day of this international conference. My name is Zurnica Petrova, and today I will be replacing Hristo Panchugov as a moderator of this morning session. Without further ado, I will now open the morning session with our third keynote speaker, Ivan Krъстев. He is a well-renowned political scientist, award-winning author, and he also holds a number of positions across different institutions, such as chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, alongside many others. I will now invite our speaker on stage. His topic today will be on democracy of the last man, the politics of demographic imagination.
The title of the conference is so important. But I'll start with something that probably is going also to touch on something that I was told that Professor Paul Betsky has been talking about, but it's an important introduction for the major point that I want to do. And this is seeing Georgi Gospodinov here. In his time shelter, people had referendums in which decade of the 20th century they want to do. Europe is basically infected by nostalgia. There is no future anymore, so you should go back to the past. Paradoxically, for many different ideological movements, 1989 is a place where they can go back. And they can go back because in a certain way, this is a very different openings. One of the places and one of the political movement for which year 1989 is of course critically important was any type of a liberal imagination, and I can believe that this is the story that we know best. But go to Kabul and talk to any of the political Islam activists, and you're going to be surprised how important for their political imagination 1989 is. This was for the first time when the Taliban movement defeated a superpower. So basically on 9/11, part of the story was it was the second coming of the 1989. Also in the political imagination of the Russian society, you're also going to be surprised to learn that in 2019, when the Levada Center asked the question, what is the most important event that happened in 1989, and they have the options of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Polish elections, also, of course, the Tiananmen, and some others, majority of the Russians said that the most important thing that happened in the 1989 was the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan. In a certain way, the end of the Soviet Union was also very much kind of a mark now retrospectively. Back then, it was not how they were seeing it back then now. Go into kind of a classical nationalistic discourse, particularly on the Balkans, and you're going to see that 1989 was the year in which Serbian President Milosevic made his major speech in basically in Kosovo. And this was kind of a rhetorical turning point in which basically brotherhood and union discourse coming from Tito Yugoslavia was dramatically reversed. And the major story, I'm not going to allow others to humiliate you, came as a very important message. And then go back to China. And of course, Tiananmen. The Chinese Communist Party has all reasons to celebrate 1989 as the major kind of a point showing the resilience of the communist system, not the fact that it is historically basically doomed. They managed to break the link between democracy and capitalism, and as Kissinger was quoted saying, he said the unification of Germany was something important, but of course the disintegration of the Soviet Union was more important than the unification of Germany, but he said, of course, the rise of China is much more important than the disintegration of the Soviet Union. I'm saying all this because there is also one other 1989, which, in my view, we try to notice much more. 1989 was also the year in which 70-year-old Elon Musk left South Africa. And suddenly kind of the experience South African experience, basically being the white minority of a country that is changing, and basically the fact of losing power, obviously, in my view, to some extent, has also influenced his views, and including basically the belief that where we should go is much more Mars than anybody else. I'm saying all this because, as a result of it, from this point of view, 1989 is critically and historically important, not simply because of what happened in Eastern Europe. Obviously, this was a much more important change, and my second argument is that following the title of this conference and the very important problematics is that it was a year in which certain important borders have been redrawn. And exactly back then, in 1989, American Professor Ken Jowett said that this is a kind of a genesis moment. He said God was doing just two things in his 6 days' work: boundarying and naming. And this is what also basically was been happening. And there he came with something that I found critically important. Unlike in 1919, which at least in Europe was a major reordering, in 1919, basically, states were traveling more than people. New states have been born. You have the idea that by basically moving borders, you're going to create much more ethnic and political cohesion. And historians here know better than me the story of this Macedonian peasant born in year 1900 who never ever left his village, but he managed and succeeded to be a citizen of 5 different states. So states have been traveling kind of more than people. And then came 1945, which was the second big reordering, and which, of course, some borders have been changed, but to be honest, much less than in 1919. But what was very much was transferring of people. Basically, people have been forced, suddenly kind of the ethnic and cultural map of particularly Eastern Europe has been changed. The most important story about 1989 was that it was not about changing the borders. It was not about forceful, basically, movement of people. The idea was that we were going to change the nature of the borders. The idea was that it would be borders easy to cross. And here Jowett made the distinctions, which I found kind of an interesting also to after that if we try to understand the revolt against the borderless world. He believes that there's 3 different types of borders which create a kind of a different identities. And he divides them on frontiers, barricades, and boundaries. Jowett is a very metaphorical type of a person, so he said basically barricades is type of identities that you cannot change. This is like a Catholic marriage. There is no divorce. Basically, this is the identity that exists on you, and in a certain way, Cold War was very much based on this type of identities. You're either here or there. Changing, basically crossing the border is a high risk. Many people have been killed trying to cross these borders. The second identity is the frontier identity. And the frontier identity is that it is extremely unstable. It's a kind of a survival identity. You very easily can go from one identity to another. And I found this critically important because one of the things that I see as a very important component of this kind of a revolt against the borderless world was it became too easy changing borders. Suddenly, something that was perceived in 1989 as kind of a promise, as an advantage, suddenly the same thing is perceived as a threat. It's too easy. I was trying, for example, to see, and I do believe this was very much also in the Bulgarian political experience and others, the very fact also that after 1990, people so easily can change their political identities with respect to the communist regime was the major preconditions for the regime to collapse. But on the other, created this type of incredible uncertainty and these questions that for 35 years, basically, what is to be authentically anti-communist? What is this identity? Why so easy? Why it is so easy? Why basically all this kind of an identity change goes so easy? And then the third border that he was talking about is the boundaries. And in a certain way, he sees the boundaries as a kind of a liberal border which is possible to cross, but you're crossing it, but it is not an easy cross. So using Hirschman's terminology is different between exit and voice. In a certain way, there is a kind of a world where loyalty is still there. Because Hirschman very much insisted that you're not divorcing or changing your party vote or leaving your country with the same easiness you shift from drinking Coca-Cola to Pepsi-Cola. Should be more difficult, should be kind of a much more constrained. And I do believe that one of the first problems that I see, and which I see very much being attacked, is that easiness of the crossing of border was perceived as the identity threat. And this is one aspect of the migration debate that, in my view, is less discussed, because normally when people talk about the cultural threat of migration, you always talk about others who are coming to you and who never can become like you. All these foreigners who are coming and they're never going to be integrated. But there is another threat of migration, and this is the others can become like you. And the moment they can become like you, suddenly, if everybody can become like you, who are you? What is the world in which the only kind of identity is universalist identity? I'm saying this because if you're going very much to go even back to the Nazi period, the problem with the assimilated Jews was not that they were not integrated in the German society. The problem with the assimilated Jews was that they were very well integrated in the German society. And I do believe this second aspect of migration, this story that suddenly the identity, and particularly getting this new identity, is becoming too easy, created a certain type of anxieties, and these anxieties have different nature, and I'm going just to focus on one on which I have been working for the last years. So I'll start with Fukuyama, and in a strange way, he's one of the most quoted and probably not the most read authors when it comes back to his famous article and after the book. But the interesting story about the Fukuyama's book is that the first article, The End of History, with a question mark, is that it was not written in 1989. It is an article written in 1988. It was published in 1989, but when I'm telling you all this, this is an article written because almost everything that I was talking about have not happened. If you read the article, you're going to see that the borders of the Cold War have never been contested. Fukuyama didn't imagine the Soviet Union is going to collapse. By the way, nobody back then is. For him, the major story was that we have the end of a certain type of view of the world in which certain type of contestations between different type of ideological projects has been ended, and it has been ended because the communist leaders themselves had basically deserved their own projects and basically have been reconciled with the capitalist modernity. So if you read the article, you're going to be surprised that everything is moving with the exception of people. Ideas are moving, goods are moving, capitals are moving, but in the article, people are not moving. In a certain way, the borders are the old borders, simply basically the nature of the regime is staying. And this is critically important because, in my view, three things followed from this understanding and this interpretation of the end of history. And the first is that the idea of the future has dramatically changed. Before, the future was perceived as something that is radically different than the present, and it has different forms. It has his leftist and he has basically his conservative views, but the story was that when we talk about the future, we talk about something that is not here. Suddenly, in the best tradition of the modernization theory, if you read the end of the history, future has arrived, but simply not everywhere. And as a result of it, space and time become kind of changing place. One of the major differences between time and space was that in space you can travel and the time you cannot. And suddenly, the moment in which basically the West is the future of the non-Western world, you can travel. You can move. In a strange way, I do believe that one of the things that also we're seeing in the politics of our countries today is that every travel in space starts to be articulated like travel in time. Many people who decide to come to the Western world, particularly back then, they're going to say that they're not simply changing geographical locations, but I'm traveling to the future. while basically I do believe for the many voters of the far right, voting ballot is the only way that you can travel back in time. But it is the travel in time and the travel in space suddenly became important. And the second assumption was that the West, the rest is going to change, but the West is going to remain the same. Exactly because of the modernization theory, so everybody is going to change. East Europeans are going to change, Chinese are going to change, but the Western societies are going to remain in the way they have been. And I do believe that this was a type of a kind of an assumption that now is very much kind of perceived of not working. So paradoxically, what we are seeing now is not, in my view, the return of history so much, but the return of the future, but future returns not as a project, but as a kind of a major threat and anxiety. Suddenly, future is back, but future is back because we start fearing it. And we start fearing the future for different reasons, and in my view, there's three different imaginations, all of them with a quite strong apocalyptical sense in it, which replace basically the utopian. The first two, which I have not been thinking much about, but which every one of you know very well, is the technological one. When is the end of the human? All this talk about artificial intelligence, is the artificial intelligence going to do this and that? It's very much basically all this talk when basically we're going to see the world very different than the present that we know because of technological changing. The second is, of course, the environmental imagination. The end of the future as basically the end of the Earth. There is going to be no much more life in the Earth, and this is basically very much described as the Extinction Rebellion, which is very universalist in its nature and which is important for the major argument that I want to make after this, believes that there are too many people in the world and there's too many people living in the way that is totally destructive for the humanity. The third imagination, which in my view is much more or less studied and I see quite much more powerfully on the rise on many different places and particularly on the political right, both Europe and outside of Europe, is demographic imagination. The last man is a famous metaphor. And even if you don't go back to Nietzsche, probably what you don't know is that the working title of George Orwell's 1984 was The Last Man. Probably he had in mind the last free man, but this was the working title on which he was working. But the last man about which I'm talking is different than the last man of the environmental imagination. In the environmental imagination, this is the last human. And this last human basically does not have ethnic characteristics. We don't know is he man or woman. In a certain way, he's just the last human. In the demographic imagination, basically the last man is the last Bulgarian, the last Hungarian, the last white man. It's a very much there. And this imagination is extremely centered on a different demographic projections. When I talk about demographic imagination, of course, I'm borrowing from Mill's idea of the sociological imagination, in which you try to see your own personal biography as a part of a bigger social process. But what is interesting and important, you suddenly start to see your own place, be ethnical, by the way, the age in which you are, and so on, through these bigger demographic trends. And from this point of view, my argument is that COVID was a period in which the demographic imagination suddenly was consolidated because people have been facing certain mortality. This was also the moment in which everybody knew exactly how old he is. Because suddenly his age has a very strong proportion, basically, for his chances to survive or not survive if he's going to be there. And as a result of it, this demographic imagination is based on the projections, which, by the way, can be totally wrong. And this is very important. Normally taking projections as the way to imagine the future is highly problematic. We know many demographic projections from before who simply didn't work like this. But my argument is that something dramatically has changed, first in the reality, but particularly in this sphere of political imagination. Modernity, as we know, was very much based on Malthusian fears that there are too many people and not enough resources. And all the stories of classical imperialism is about this. Suddenly, we're living in a world in which, at present, between 1965 and 2014, the fertility rate in the world globally went down twice. the biggest problem is where are the children? And the question where the children is becoming a highly political question, because in a strange way, the change, like the democratization in the 1990s, this kind of a major decline of fertility cannot be explained simply by the classical demographic transition in the way the spread of democracy of the 1990s cannot be easily explained by the classical democratic theory of the previous period. In the previous period, you know that in country to become a democracy, probably certain income levels were important and certain education level, classical Lipset. And suddenly some countries in Africa, which does not fit this criteria, decided to have elections, wanted to be a democracy. So now we know from the demographic transition theory that the level of education of women, the certain level of material development are very much determining certain decline of fertility rates. But why Nepal? You have a dramatic decline. Why in places? It comes as a mystery. By the way, now in the majority of the countries of the world, societies have a fertility below the replacement level. In 2100, it is going to be 97% of the countries in the world. Suddenly you have the feeling that collectively, society has decided not to reproduce, and what is critically important, this is the results of the individual decisions of billions of different persons that cannot be easily explained. And in order to just give you a graphics, why some of this kind of a new trend can be so scary for many is that imagine a country like South Korea. One of the major kind of successes of modernization, country with a very high level of the standard of living, countries which are, by the way, no migration, highly homogeneous. They basically, if the current trends are there, South Korea is going to lose half of its population in the next 20 years. I'm even not talking about the change of the structure of society on the level of age. And just we're talking about physical numbers. And imagine that we're talking about a country that is very much in a difficult security situation, basically facing North Korea and all this. Just imagine what it means that if you're a government and you're spending a huge amount of money and the results are basically zero. Part of the nature of the South Korean marriage, according to the specialist, explains what is happening. As some of the Korean women said, we don't want to marry this man. But the result is, go beyond the explanation. This is a major and radical change, and which is happening almost everywhere, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa. It goes beyond the distinctions between democracy and autocracy. In the case of China, of course, one-child policy strongly contributed to this. And my idea is that this kind of a demographic imagination, which is very much pushing how, for the first time, societies are facing a phenomenon on which we do not have a collective experience, namely living with depopulation, in my view, is changing the logic of certain type of political behaviors. And I'm just going to give you two examples to do it. So the examples are going to be slightly radicalized to make the point. I'm quite aware that there's some additional explanation for what I'm going to tell you. But I'm going to argue first that you cannot understand the decision of President Putin to start the war in Ukraine if you are not going basically to be aware of an absolute obsession of the Russian leadership with the Russia's demographic decline. From the very first day, basically the Russian president in 2001 came to office. He made basically the reverse of the demographic trends of losing of the population, and Russia has lost, since the end of the Soviet Union, 17 million people, as one of his major priorities. During the transition period of the 1990s, basically the fertility rate of Russia has collapsed, basically 39%. And also this is a country which in the world has the highest gap between the female and the male mortality. Women in Russia live 12 years longer than men. And keeping in mind that the average duration of the Russian marriage is 10 years, keep in mind that many Russian women live longer as widows than as wives. Normally, this is a classical situation of a country that comes out of a war. this kind of a major disproportions between male life expectancy and the women life expectancy. And it shows something quite interesting. For the West, the Cold War was peace. For the Russia was war that was lost. I'm saying this because you're going to be surprised to see that 6 months before the war in Ukraine, without being asked, the Russian president on several occasions started very much to dwell on the problem that the country cannot survive, and basically the Russian civilization is going to be doomed if it is not going to reverse the demographic trends. I have here kind of quotes that I can offer you, and by the way, there are much more, but first was a speech basically which he was giving to the students in Vladivostok, in which basically he said, if we're not going to basically increase our population, we can never basically exercise of any type of influence in the world. And suddenly the figure of 500 million came up. And this was very much based on the calculation done by famous Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev at the end of the 19th century, who basically calculated that in the year 2000 there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. It became basically so important, this figure, and so magic for the Russian imagination, that the Russian World Congress basically came and said that Russia is never going to fulfill its mission in the world if in the 21st century you're not going to end up with 500 or 600 million Russians. The problem is that after 2017, and COVID was very bad for Russia, 1 million excess deaths and others, suddenly the population basically started declining again, regardless of the real money that had been put by the Russian government in this. There was a classical pro-natalist policies. They didn't work much anyway. They didn't work in Russia too. But it is not that there was not an effort to give much more money to mothers and basically to very strongly reward people and families which are going to have a few, much more people. And by the way, now, just where we're speaking several weeks ago, the Russian parliament criminalized any propaganda of a child-free life. So basically, if you're going for any reasons which is different than going to a monastery to praise the life without children, this is going to be perceived as a crime. By the way, the first anti-Western legislation that had been voted in Russia was the famous Dima Yakovlev law, which banned American families from adopting Russian orphans. Why I'm saying this? In my view, this is critically important because I do believe in order to understand any event, you should try to understand something that looks strange. And this look that looks very much strange, particularly if you're trying to look at what is happening in the Russia-Ukrainian war through the prisms of what we know from the Yugoslav wars and others, was the major abduction of kids. You're not going to see basically Serbs going and abduct Croat kids and the other way around, and you're not going to see this with the Kosovars and others. Why are you abducting kids? And I do believe the story that this is our kids. And from this point of view, this OPSU you go, and in a certain way, the way you see Belarusians, Russians, very much as the reserve army of the Russian ethnos, that makes this war very different than the classical ethnic wars of the Yugoslav war, which are the separation wars. Here, basically, if you have a genocide which is inclusive, you're killing others not because they're different than you, but because they insist that they're like you. I'm killing you because you're Russian. I'm trying to kill you in the way you're waking up others to understand who you are, because basically identity is not simply a free choice. The identity is there, and this identity is very much there. And I'm saying this because the problem with the demographic decline is how you explain it. And exactly because it's mysterious and because it comes in different places, you either can explain it as a natural process of the way people are reevaluating their lives, and this is individual choices, so it's not collective choices, or you can, what the Russians are doing, explain it as a part of the cultural war. Because the West does not have enough kids, they don't want us to have enough kids. And as a result of it, in this kind of a war, everything, this explains total obsession with basically gay lives and gay choices, which is very much about not having kids. This is about basically trying others not to have kids in order to be unable to compete with us. And this is why, in my view, we see a war which in its nature, while when you look what is happening on the battleground, so much looks as thing that you have seen in 20th century all the time, much more reminded me of something that is well known to the historians from the 17th century North America, where the Native American tribes, after the arrival of the Europeans, where you have quite a lot of diseases and wars and so on, you have a major kind of demographic crisis. And they have something which is called the mourning wars, where one tribe attacked the others in order to kidnap wives and children because they want to compensate their mourning for their own that have been lost. Suddenly, basically getting other people's in order basically to strengthen your own ethnic groups. And this is why suddenly the problem of the demographic decline became at the center of a certain type of identity anxiety, that how we are going to allow basically simply nations or individuals to make any type of identity as a free choice. You are one or the other. There is a much more natural determination of the national belonging, and from this point of view, you can do it and not do it. I'm saying this not simply because on this level we see the logic of the war are very different than many others. And by the way, the only major increase of the population of Russia after 2010 came as a result of the annexation of Crimea. Suddenly the Russian population went up with 2.4 million people. But also that in a certain way, demography is very much also defining the Ukrainian strategy in the war. Because the other country with extremely difficult demographic profile is Ukraine itself. In the year 1992, when Ukraine basically became an independent state, there were 52 million people living in the country. When the war started, there was around 40 million. Now, according to the experts, there are around between 26 and 27 million who are basically living on the territory controlled by the Ukrainian government. And I'm saying this because if you don't keep in mind this kind of a major demographic factor in the political and military thinking, you're never going to understand why the Ukrainian government is not mobilizing people between 18 and 24-year-old. Because the moment you basically mobilize these people, and if some of these people are going to be killed, you're also going to kill all these babies that are never going to be born. And in a certain way, you have a demographic cost which is so high. And I do believe that this kind of a centrality, not simply of a demographic change, but of anxiety about demography. The anxiety about demography that is very much affecting different identity anxieties explain a lot of things. By the way, explains quite a lot about American elections and total obsession with the migrants coming who are going to have a voting rights. To be honest, from this point of view, you know that this was true for President Trump. This was very strong in the Mr. Musk's emails. This is a kind of a classical Brechtian fear that governments will start to elect their own people because of the possibility of kind of a major migrations, and you're going to give the citizenship for people who are going to vote for you, all these kind of stories. And this comes with, and this is my last point, as a result of it, I do believe that this changing nature of the future, while everybody claims that what happened now is we have the return of the past and people are simply going to the much more nostalgic vision of the world. You have both nostalgic left and nostalgic right. I do believe that what has changed is that the future has returned, but the utopian future in a certain way was very much replaced by dystopian future. By the way, if you go to Hollywood and to literature, you're going to see that one of the most powerful dystopian novels that have been written recently are very much centered around the crisis of fertility. Margaret Atwood, for sure, and the role of the women and pressure on women on this. But secondly, there is an important book called Children of Men of P.D. James, which basically telling the story of a world in which suddenly no new baby was born. And how this is changing the aging structure of society, and how basically this is changing, and I'm not touching on the economic issues as a whole. Why I'm going to end up on this and why for me this is important? Because I always believe that one of the most important stories, particularly in borders and democratic politics, is not simply the space borders, but it's also the times borders and the continuous of different type of projects. We, in this strange moment in which suddenly the immortality of the individual started to be discussed as an opportunity. Particularly in Silicon Valley, you're going to see people who really talk about the immortality of something that can happen, and can happen in our lifetime. Woody Allen has this great line in which he said, "I want to live forever, but not in the hearts of the people. I want to live in my apartment in Manhattan." But as a result of it, suddenly what we started to see is that we see very much the collapse of all these kind of instruments with which we had been trying to fight individual immortality. Be it family, having kids, they're going to live for us. And we have been discussing, I understand that there was an open, interesting article just recent days in the New York Times, not about young people do not having kids, but about the mourning of the grandparents for not having grandchildren. On the other side, the nation. You basically can sacrifice your life for the nation, but you cannot be promised anymore that you're going to be remembered, because basically nobody can give you assumptions that basically the nation is going to be around. And even for the literature people, for people who are doing art, the story that basically you're going to, your art is going to survive and basically go beyond your life because the community is there. No matter what is really at risk, and this is the major attack on the world that was born from 1989, is that it put into question society as an intergenerational project. Focus on individual and individual choices suddenly basically is challenging the idea of the society as the intergenerational project. Is society is different if you basically is not thinking in future in terms of how our kids are going to live, how it's going to be, and this is a major change. As I said, you're going to say this kind of a last man story, both on the left, very different form with environment, on the right with the demographic story, but as a result of it, and this is the really last point, it's a huge problem for any democracy, because democracy is preconditioned on the idea of an open future. Democracy is preconditioned on the fact that the elections, you can first solve some problems today, but the very important is that others you can solve tomorrow. Secondly, that you have an agency to change it, and that the elections is very much a kind of a moment in which all the time past and future talking to each other. Because I'm looking back to basically judge the performance of the government, but I'm seeing for the promises of what they're told to me. So from this point of view, and as a result of it, the idea of the last man suddenly brought this fear of the last elections. I'm not ready, basically. I cannot be sure that they're going to be next elections, because the body politics can change so dramatically that basically if we're not, I'm never going to win anymore. So this is why, and I'm ending on this, I do believe that demographic imagination is probably more important to understand some of the structural changes of politics 3 decades after 1989 than usually it is. And this is demographic change which is based on real demographic changes, but it is much more based also on a certain type of a demographic projections, and based on the major idea that future stop to be a project and really it's become a projections, and projections that can really create a certain type of apocalyptic expectations with them. So this was the last word about the last man.